Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations about our schools. My guest today is Dr. Peter Coleman. Peter is a professor of psychology at Columbia University, and among the many roles he plays, he's co-executive director of Columbia University's Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity. Since he is one of the world's leading experts on constructive conflict resolution, he's really the perfect guest for our podcast, which is trying to make sense of the culture wars in education and whether there's a way out of the toxic conflicts that are wreaking havoc on our public school systems around the country. Speaking of the way out, one of Dr. Coleman's recent books is titled The Way Out: How to Overcome Toxic Polarization. Peter, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Peter, in the book I just mentioned, you write we are in the grip of a more than 50-year escalating trend of political, cultural, and geographical polarization. Talk to me and our listeners about what's contributed to that trend and what some of the effects of that trend have been.
Yeah, so so thanks for the question. It's a complicated response that I'll oversimplify, but there is no one cause or driver for this, 50, 60-year pattern we're stuck in. But we did see evidence beginning, say, in the 1970s of, Republicans and Democrats feeling less tolerant of one another, more estranged from one another, sort of from the bottom up in communities. And we saw evidence in Washington of more and more obstructionism, less bipartisanship, so basically our government, the camps within the government, the tribal groups within the government started to diverge in the mid to late 70s and continue to today. And again, there are many different measures of political polarization. There's affective, how you feel about them and how do you feel about your own group. There's ideological, there's a variety of ways that scientists measure it. But on many of these indices, we've seen it getting worse and worse, really, since the, let's say, late 1970s. And today, historians like John Meacham and Doris Kearns Goodwin are really drawing parallels between the 1850s in America, which was right before the Civil War. So it's a toxic time. It's a politically unstable time. There are some good things that can come from that, but it's also very concerning.
And Peter, one of the things that you say in your book that caught my attention, and I was a bit surprised by it, and I've been thinking about it since I read it, is that the good news is that most Americans are miserable right now. Why is that good news?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's some irony in it, but it's a fact. So there's a theory of change about when societies that are really entrenched in a particular pattern actually do pivot and change. And we've seen this around the world, in Costa Rica in 1948, and the Scandinavian countries did this like in the 1800s. So there are times when societies who have a history of either civil war or civil strife really reset. And some of the conditions, so we know something about the conditions that help. And one of the things is something called ripeness theory, which is really that you have to have enough people that are miserable, that they're not happy with the status quo. They don't like politics as usual. They don't like the screaming matches and the dysfunction and the stalemates. And they're really looking to change. And so the good news is that, something like somewhere between 67 and 93% of Americans are part of what this group called More in Common, that studies polarization in different countries and in the US. They call it the exhausted majority, that the vast majority of us are just, fed up with the craziness. We're tired of our addiction to our devices and to the hate and to all the contentiousness that we see on television and on internet and media, and, are really ready for something else. And that is a good condition if we know what to do about it. Right. So it can just make us anxious and worried and angry. But eventually, if people feel like they have an alternative, there's another option, they're much more inclined to move in that way if they're miserable.
Amanda Ripley, who wrote this book that I'm sure you're familiar with, and I'm sure you are familiar with her work. She talks about one of the paradoxes of high conflict is that people are both drawn to conflict and are ready to fight, and the same people have this are haunted by it, and if given the right opportunity, would also choose a different path if they could.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the challenge is that this phenomenon, this culture that we're in of divisiveness is bigger than you and I.
Mm.
So, you can decide today, or I can decide today, okay, enough. I've had enough. I don't want to do this anymore. I really refuse to, vilify an entire half of this country and whatever. But then, something comes up in the news or on Twitter, or someone makes a comment, or, and you get triggered, and we get pulled back into these strong dynamics. And so, there is a constellation of things that are working in concert to pit us against each other and pull us apart. And so it's not just us and our choices. That's important, and we can make those choices. But all I'm saying is, sort of like an addiction, it's a hard thing to fight against, because there are so many conditions that pull us back into the division.
And I think the lesson there is that if we just see that, gee, I feel like I've gotten pulled back into something that feels toxic. It isn't just me; it's all these forces around me.
Yeah.
And we'll get into some of those forces, because I'd like to shift now and have you share your thoughts about the culture wars that have been so damaging to our school systems, and they're playing out. And I'm sure it's part of the larger problem that you've been describing that exists in our society at large. But talk a little bit about what you've learned about depolarization and how it sort of explains what's going on with these culture wars, where school board members are resigning, and people are sort of systematically voting in new people that are pushing conflict and calling for book bans and radical changes to school policy. And whether you have some insights into what it will take for us to sort of escape these culture wars and get back to a place where not where there's necessarily no conflict or disagreement, because I think that's really a really essential, healthy part of any democratic process. But what will it take to get back to, so we can begin listening to each other and having our schools function the way that I think we all hope that they would?
Yeah. So, along the lines of what I was just saying is, we are in an era where it's much more common to be triggered and frustrated and angry at, them and holding them responsible. So that's the backdrop for what's happening in our schools. I do think that what today we're seeing in the schools is, affected by this culture, affected by decades of, this political division. But I also think it's different, because I think what we're seeing is, people are very sensitive to children. We're very affected by how children are treated, when children are abused, when children are shot, in school shootings, when we see children that are, affected by war, by famine, by, we are as a species very sensitive to children. And I do think that schools and young kids in schools are a very sensitive space in our society. And I think that there are, bad actors in the political space that are very aware of that. So there is an intentionality to what's happening in the schools. In other words, what I think is part of what's really driving that. Part of it, again, is just the culture that we're in. But I also think that there are intentional actors that are targeting schools, targeting librarians, and not only, what books the librarians, share or encourage students to read, but they're targeting them personally now, right? if you look into this, what you find out is that these are campaigns. These are not things that just happen like, in a local school and suddenly a mom says, hey, this isn't right. And, says something to the principal and pushes back. These are strategic campaigns where people realize that if you speak to a community that their children are being threatened by some idea or some information or some, challenge to traditional gender roles, that it is a nerve and it does mobilize. So, again, on the one hand, what we're seeing play out in schools is what we're seeing play out in Washington, D.C. and in state capitals and elsewhere, which are, differences over gender identity, tolerance for gay rights, tolerance for LGBTQ plus individuals. And that's, again, part of the national discourse right now. But the school board meetings that are so tense are often being created intentionally by political actors that see a lot of value in this politically. In other words, and I think this is, to some degree, this is its own undoing. To some degree, we are being manipulated. Now, look, we're being manipulated by mass media that knows that we're addicted to outrage. We're being manipulated by social media platforms that know that more provocative, contentious content gets our attention and keeps us addicted to social media. So there's a lot of people at fault here, but there are also actors that are intentionally manipulating our concerns about our children as if this literally were like an armed gunman in our schools. Of course, there are armed gunmen in our schools, and that's not what we're focused on. We're focused on the librarians' books that they're sharing, right?
Yeah, one of the other facets of this, I would just add to the list of things that you talked about with respect to books and concerns that are raised now about what teachers are doing with respect to LGBTQ plus students and the allegations of grooming is now that in several states we're really making it difficult for teachers to talk about our history and to talk about race and racism and the more I have thought about it, and I think how could people possibly come in and say we shouldn't teach about race and racism? It seems so racist on its face. But I think what I'm beginning to understand is that the narrative that's being told about that to community members and parents is that it's not that they don't recognize that there are inequities and there's racism, but the story is being told that your kids, your white kids, are being made to feel shame and to feel guilty. And so people that haven't been in schools lately are thinking, and I get this, if they're making my kids feel guilty about being white, I don't want that. We didn't have anything to do with this, and I was sympathetic, and we're good people, and now they're trying to blame me and my children. I think that's part of that's part of this deliberate campaign, is to appeal to that sense. But then people, more progressive people, say, well, wait a minute, that's just racist. You don't want to acknowledge, but it's actually not that they don't want to acknowledge and might even be willing to do something about racism, but they're responding to a different problem.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, even if you're a 50-year-old plumber and you're on, under sinks all day fixing rusty pipes and, your knees hurt and you're working hard, and then people want to challenge you about your privilege, people have very little patience for that if their life is hard and they're trying to do the right thing, but they're being challenged. So I think it is the oversimplification of these problems as being, you're all, white privileged, you're all, responsible for what's happened in the past.
So Peter, let's talk about what you might recommend to people in a school district where they truly have become exhausted, and you have school board members ready to quit. I didn't sign up for this kind of conflict, and people coming to meetings and yelling at me, or teachers who are feeling if they use certain vocabulary, they could be fired or sued because of new laws, and they're throwing their hands up and saying, yeah, I'm miserable like a lot of Americans are, and I'm ready to quit. What is there any hope for people in those cases that have been, they might recognize, yes, it's bigger than us. It's not just that one person that comes and yells at us. It's bigger than that. But I just don't know if I can go on, and this is too hard. What do you recommend for people in that kind of circumstance?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. My recommendation is to, first be aware that you're not alone. There are many of us that feel the same thing. We feel sort of trapped by the culture we're in. We're by our own in-group and how we get shamed and shunned within our own group. If we even consider, an alternative position on some, hot issue. So that's where I would start. And, I know that we'll talk about this idea of this challenge that we have, but there's a series of exercises that we've put together, which are small things that you can do every day and that we really recommend you do as a group. And this is something, I'll talk about. We can send out links to some articles. I have a piece in Time magazine about this on this today that was just published. And it is an opportunity for groups of people that are trying to explore different things to do something small every day, because we're all busy and tired and, trying our best. But these are feasible little things that you can do to start to reflect on yourself, start to reintroduce some kind of honesty to your friend group in terms of your political ambivalence, maybe reach out to people on the other side, maybe work at the community level. There are groups, particularly in education right now, that are trying to combat these combative meetings and sessions and processes within schools. So there are allies that you can turn to for support. And that might be just members of your own community or groups and organizations that are trying to help fight this at the district level or at the school level. And so that's where I would start.
One of the things you alluded to earlier, and then now in my question about the culture wars in education, is reaching out to people who think differently than you, and maybe trying to find some common ground. Like this isn't leading to anywhere good ultimately, right? And maybe we could agree on that. And can we start, reclaiming our school and at least reclaim this idea that we have to be civil towards each other, even if we end up disagreeing. I was intrigued by something you talk about in your book, and I think I have felt and experienced this problem, but you talk about the friend problem, and I think that's about what happens with your friends if you decide, you muster the courage that I'm going to go talk to that person and not shame them and not hold them in contempt, but I'm actually going to go talk to them and say, I want to hear what you have to say. I want to better understand where you're coming from. And then maybe you'd be willing to listen to me, and maybe we can find some way to move forward together, even if we end up not agreeing, but at least agreeing to hear each other. How does the friend problem sort of play out, or describe what it is and how it might play out in school systems?
Yeah, so this is related to what I was trying to say about your group, right? Your friend group, the people that you share values with politically, that you maybe talk about politics, you ruminate with, we have these people most of us in our lives who share our political orientation, but like the students at Columbia University, more and more can't be honest. They can't share their own confusion about the positions of, more extreme members on their own team, right? Or their own ambivalence about some of these ideas and challenges. They can't talk about them. They can't process them. So we don't have a place where we can be honest because we can't talk across the divide. There's nobody there, and we can't talk to our own groups. And so this is the friend problem. The friend problem is that, if you do that, you may jeopardize your standing, your status, even your job, right? If you say or try to do certain things, you may become shunned as well. And this is, again, this is a classic thing that's happened through the ages, right? Where communities get very tight and they don't like people that push back or that challenge the status quo or that start to think differently or talk to the other side, right? And that's where we are as a society. So that's one of the reasons why this challenge that I'm talking about, it starts, the challenge is a 4-week experience. The first week we ask you to think about you and your own tendencies and inclinations and assumptions and what you want to do, like what your choices are. So we ask you to spend some time with you. The second week is with your friends. And it is really pivoting from a focus on you to focusing on, am I comfortable speaking up with my friends? And if not, why not? And what does that mean? And how might I start to do that kind of slowly and carefully so that I don't, trigger any backlash, but I can start to introduce a little bit more nuance and a little bit more tolerance into our own conversations. A key driver of this, the further and further our tribes get away from each other, and the more that we see them, on the other side as extreme, the more extreme we get, and the tighter we get, and the more afraid we are to speak up. And so working there, frankly, is for many of us makes us as anxious as reaching out across the divide, because there's so much at stake if you say and do things that your friends will react negatively to. So it's a tricky area. We respect that. But it's a critical area to start to think about and start to kind of nudge a bit in order to try to start to loosen that up.
Yeah, I think what I have felt personally is that there's sort of the risk of feeling like you've betrayed your cause if you say, I'm going to listen and think about and reach out to people whose perspectives not only are different, but I think that I hold in contempt. But I'm going to start speaking with them. And perhaps I don't really understand them as well as I think I do. Perhaps not everyone on the other side is as bad as I think, but you do run the risk of having your friends think that you're by doing that. But what I have found, just where I came from personally, and I think this is probably what you're trying to do with the political courage challenges, I got tired of taking that position. It wasn't working. I'm only talking with people that think like me, and it's not working. It's only getting worse. And so what I have told my friends is that I have to find a different way. I want to start engaging with people who think differently than me. And in this podcast, I've invited people in who have made people who are part of the culture wars, claiming the schools are indoctrinating kids, and starting by making the problem more complex. Like, what exactly do you mean by indoctrination? And then asking a question like, well, if that's your definition and you don't like it, isn't the Pledge of Allegiance a form of indoctrination? And, that caused everyone on our call, when we talked about indoctrination, to pause and say, well, that does fit the definition, and I have to think about that a little bit. And as soon as people start pausing and say, I have to start thinking about it and inject a little humility into the conversation, then everything changes.
Yeah, I think that's true. Amanda Ripley wrote a great article in 2018 about Jefferson County, New York, which is upstate New York, and the article was about the more politically tolerant counties in the country, and she profiled this particular place, a town up there, and one of the things that she saw up there, she found, was that there was a reverend who would every Monday morning would cook a breakfast himself, and he said it was a great breakfast. And he would invite people across the political spectrum to come to breakfast, and they would talk about politics. And then they would come back the next week. And he said they come back because the food's good, and the conversation is respectful and good, but, stimulating. And he said the benefit of that is that when people come back again and again, you start to talk about an issue long enough that you start to realize what you don't really understand, right? Because the truth is, let's take immigration. It's an immensely complicated thing, right? It has economic elements, it has moral elements. There's a lot. We're a nation of immigrants. There's that, right? So there are all these implications when we talk about something complicated like that, And yet what happens in the media and what happens through political speech is that it becomes simplified. We're talking about a wall, right? That's what it gets boiled down to. And the truth is, you can talk about the wall for, an hour, but then it's like, well, let's move on. What else is relevant here? And he said, that's why this works, is because people talk about complicated issues long enough until they realize, oh, I don't know. I don't really understand that. I don't know why that happens, and that's when things loosen up, right?
Yeah. Another example of a complicated issue, and you alluded to it earlier when we talked about the examples of the culture wars and how they're playing out, is this idea of book banning. And it's like the wall is like that's the symbol of immigration. Are you for it or against it? And it's so much more complicated. Well, book banning is much more complicated. When I had people on this podcast talking about whether some books should be restricted or kids should be restricted from seeing some books, and there was this sort of, I'm for book banning, or they said, I don't want to call it book banning. We want to deselect them in these cases. We're not saying but I said, well, there are some books that I think all of us would agree shouldn't be in any school library, ones that teach kids how to make a bomb or that are just blatantly obscene, and they're not in libraries, and we all agree. So we do agree that some books should be banned from school libraries or school classrooms. So it isn't that everything should be allowed. The question is, where do we draw the line? What criteria do we use? And then it gets complicated. And as soon as we get to that point of realizing it's a little more complicated than we want to think it is, or people tell us it is, then people start listening a little bit, because I don't think I understand it as well as I should. And yes, this is a blurred line here when it comes to what we talk about with kids, or what materials we have them giving kids access to.
Yeah, I think it's very important to share those conversations where, we really start to interrogate and question, what do we mean by these things, and what are the criteria, and what are the differences, and how subjective are these things? The other thing I just want to say quickly is I completely agree with your basic idea of bringing people in and trying to unpack these things that become oversimplified. I think that's very important. One of the things that I've tried to do, I've spoken about this elsewhere, is a practice that I've been trying to do for the past 2 or 3 years is I've identified, 4 or 5 sources, people, and organizations that are what I would call decent, well-intentioned, and well-informed, and often politically opposed to my values. Right? They often have positions on issues that are very different from mine, but I feel like they're in it, for good reasons. They keep informed historically and in terms of science. What happens when the news breaks is I go intentionally to these sources. So something happens, China, Russia, whatever, something happens that is going to be weaponized. And our tendency will be to go to our news that we're very comfortable with and listen to our news and not go to the other side. But what I force myself to do is try to find these people. Now, let me be clear. I don't go to the nutcases on the other side. There are many opinionated nutcases on both sides, and I don't waste my time there. I just feel like that's just bad faith. What I try to do is challenge myself in my own comfort zone, because I'm so inclined to just stay in my own rumor mill, or my own, rumination mill, and listen and hear the things that I want to hear. And you really have to push yourself these days, because of the divisions in the news, to find alternative points of view that you think are well-intentioned. You can still totally disagree with them, right? But then it's not personal and it's not reactive, it's intentional. That's a practice that I would recommend to everybody. And I think for me would be a litmus test. If I had a podcast, I'd want to say, is this individual well-intentioned, well-informed? And let's have that conversation, because that's a different level of conversation. One of the things I did last summer for our challenge is I went for a walk with a neighbor of mine who I had felt became estranged from. I'd known him for a while. It was just casually as an acquaintance, seemed like an okay guy. Then he started to talk about politics, and it seemed to me like he was insane. So I basically stopped talking to him for about a year and a half. And I intentionally reached out to him. Now, again, given what he was saying and the news he was consuming, I would have just written him off. But instead, I decided to ask him to go for a walk with me in the park outside, and we did that. And in the process of spending time with him, he told his story about where he came from, which gave me some context as to why he believes in the things he believes. I told my story and he heard it. And then we talked to a place where nuance arrived, right? At first, there were talking points and, a lot of, anger. But we kind of were able, through the time that we walked together, to ride through that wave and, get to a place that was a little bit more nuanced, where there was some doubt. And so what I want to be clear about is, what I was saying is that there are people in the public discourse that I've identified that I feel are decent, well-intentioned, well-informed, and often politically wrong, right? From my view, right? And those are the people I seek out. And that's my criteria. Do I feel like they're smart people? And I would say, so I'll name George Will is one, right? George Will is, I think, a very smart, well-intentioned, decent person. And then sometimes politically he says things, and I think, David Brooks, another one, many, I think, well-intentioned, whatever, but then sometimes he'll say things and I'll think, what are you talking about? How could you get there? So it is identifying people that you think are well-intentioned in the game, even if politically they're in a very different place from you. That's good. That's okay. We need that in our life. But I want to make a distinction between public personalities or public pundits and people in the rest of your life, because I wouldn't write people off that say things. We have an inclination. We hear one thing and it's like, oh, okay, we're out. I'm out. They've said that. No way. Well, that's what I did with this man until I forced myself to go for a walk with him. And then I got it. It's like, oh, this makes sense to me, given where you came from, what your experience is, the community you belong to. Like, I understand this now because I allowed myself to learn his context. So I want to be clear about, I'm not recommending that you necessarily write everybody off in your life, that has extreme opinions. But if you're going to consume information and news from the other side, have some kind of litmus test for who you think is well-intentioned in that space.
This may be the same person you were just now referring to, that you wrote about in the Time magazine article.
Yeah.
I remember there was another aspect to that I just want to call attention to and see if you agree with my perspective. What I recall you doing with that person in your walk in the park is you spent a long time listening to the person.
Yeah.
And what I'm learning about listening is, as people like Monica Guzman, who I've interviewed, and Amanda talk about, is that people, most of us, more than just about anything, want to be heard and we want to be understood. And so if someone like you takes the time to really listen, not interrupt and not argue, and tell me if I got this right, is this what you're saying? At some point, people really appreciate that and feel respected, even if they know you may not agree, but you're being curious, you're open to the idea that your understanding of me may be different than what I thought you would think. And then this particular person sort of came around and softened up a little bit and was open to the idea, and even was curious to know about your work and wanted to read your book. And even said, as I recall, that when you asked, are you going to vote for Trump again, said, I don't think so.
Yeah.
And probably would have said that.
Yeah. Not if I was challenging him. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
No, it's
right.
true. So I want to say was a really interesting set of studies done by a neuroscientist that was published a few years ago about dialogue between what he would say is members of high power groups and low power groups. So he looked at Israelis and Palestinians in dialogue, and he looked at Arizonan citizens and illegal immigrants in Arizona in dialogue. Emile Bruneau was his name. He passed away about 2 years ago. And he did this study, and he was interested in what happens in these dialogues to really influence people's attitudes, soften them up, have them have their attitude shifts. And what he found is that when people feel when they feel in low power, when they feel one down, like Palestinians in Israel feel like second-class citizens, that they really need to feel heard, because they spend all of their life listening to the other and trying to pay close attention to them, because that's one way to control them and predict them, is listen carefully, but they're never heard, right? And so they really need to be heard in order for their attitudes to shift. Those in higher power, like us white guys, what we really need in order to shift is to shut up and listen. Because people listen to us most of the time, and we're used to that, and we're addicted to that. And so to really be quiet and listen to the other side. And I think that, was really held true for this past summer, because, there's been this political shift in this country since Trump lost the election and Biden won the election. And even though it's contested, there is this power dynamic that happens. And I do think a lot of Republicans and Trump Republicans feel misunderstood, alienated, held in contempt, and never listened to. And so the idea of listening to this person and allowing him to speak his piece was very intentional. And again, one of the things I did before I went on this walk with this neighbor of mine is I said to I prepared, and I said to myself, all right, what do I want to do here? Like, do I want to just challenge him and, counter him and humiliate him and whatever, take him to task? Or do I want to try to understand where this comes from and what does this mean? And why is he so passionate about it? And the only way I'm going to get there is if I shut up and listen. So importantly, we started by, I can't remember if he asked me or if I asked him first, but sort of like, what is your story? Who are you? Because we don't know each other, And so I told him my story of my upbringing and my religion and my, where I grew up and my siblings and my wife and my kids. Told him my story. He told me his story. And that's very important, because I think, we move to politics really quickly, which is, again, and we get into an issue that we don't know much about, and then we're stuck. And then we feel so much negativity about the other side that we can't get out of that. If you start with your stories, who are you? And you try to keep it personal and honest, that sets up a very different dynamic. And so from there, I just listened. My next question after was, who are you? Was, so tell me about your affinity to Trump. Can you elaborate on that for me? And he went into about a 40-minute, monologue. About 30 of it was tirade and, some, what I would say is relatively crazy talking points. I didn't challenge him. He expected me to, to do battle with me. He came prepared for battle. But I listened, and I would sort of say, let me check my understanding. Is this what you're saying? So I really just listened actively. And then what happened is, as you were referring to, is that it was like we rode a wave, that he needed to say certain things and get through the talking points. He listens to a lot of Breitbart and a lot of, Fox News. And so he was hitting those kind of main talking points. But eventually he came to his own sense of ambivalence about the Trump, the candidate, the party. He really started to, because I wasn't keeping his defenses up by challenging him and I was just listening, he eventually worked through his own angst and came to his own doubt. And I think that's so much more powerful way for people to begin to be honest with themselves than if we're challenging one another and performing this sort of debate, which goes nowhere.
See, he knew that he could say that because you weren't going to shame him for having doubt, right?
He learned that. I mean, again, I think when we came in, he was expecting me to go right after him, and the fact that I didn't was disarming, right? It really was sort of, and so he kind of found his way to his own criticism, his own check and balance, because I wasn't offering any. I was just receiving and listening. And, to some degree, I think that's a way to go. I will say one thing. There is a thing that the Democratic Party has become very fond of. It's something called deep canvassing. And it is a strategy that Democrats use. I mean, maybe Republicans are using it, but I know Democrats invented it, and it is about listening, and it is about trying to connect with people and hear their stories and have some rapport. But my problem with that is that in some ways it weaponizes listening, because ultimately what they're hoping to do is find a way to persuade them to vote for their candidates and vote for their positions. And I think what that does is it, in some ways, weaponizes dialogue and listening. I didn't want to do that. My hope was that I would learn. That was my one objective, which I did. I learned a lot about his history and his context and his values and his community. But my intention was not to change his mind. But what happened in this more respectful walk, and again, we were walking physically outside together, which is another important component of the strategy that we tried, is that he was able to come to his own doubts. And I think that is much more powerful.
Yeah, if you use listening as a tool and you're going into it, you say, I'm going to listen so that I can develop enough trust so that I can get them to think like I do.
Yeah.
It probably won't work.
Well, that's the point. I've had, I've talked to some, of my activist friends and they disagree, but I'm concerned about it because I do feel like, look, most of the Republican wing of this country finds bridge building, dialogue groups, all of these encounter groups very suspicious because they think that we're just trying to seduce them and get them in a place where we can change their mind. And so if we're doing that with listening and dialogue intentionally, again, I understand it is a political maneuver and it may be effective as a political maneuver, but I think it's gonna harm our capacity to really argue that listening is a powerful thing if you can, do it for purposes that are less instrumental than that.
Coming from a genuinely curious place.
Yeah.
Peter, I want to go back to something just briefly that you mentioned before, because I think it has very direct implications for school environments. And you talked about the importance of listening and being heard and so forth. And what happens when you have a different kind of power dynamic and you have people in power and people with less power. School board meetings are like that. You have people physically sitting higher than the rest of the people. They all have microphones in front of them. They have these titles, the representative from this area, and then you have people sitting down in chairs, and they have one microphone. They get to come up, and they shout because they don't feel that anyone is hearing them, and they're frustrated. I think the lesson there, and school board meetings are not they're governed by all these rules about how long you get to speak, are not good places to do this. But it doesn't prevent school board members from engaging with the public in very different ways, where they're sitting down at the same level and saying, what we're doing here today at this school is just listening to each other about the issues. Like, one thing I've done recently with some schools is to say, what do we appreciate most about this school and this district? What would make this school district even better? What are the challenges? But most importantly, for school board members is to come in and say, my job is to listen and to clarify and say, do I understand this right? That, I think, is a really potentially huge lesson for people that are struggling in these
Yeah,
districts.
I like what I hear you proposing is either you're identifying an existing kind of innovation or proposing, an adjustment to these board meetings, which is that, they're oftentimes seen as debate spaces and decision-making meetings, right? And it might be useful to separate out. We need to listen. We need to find opportunities to really hear from the public, as you say, maybe check your understanding of what they're saying so that there is a sense that people feel heard and respected, and then bring that information to a decision process, bring that information right. But these are, again, one of the points I make in the book is that we as Americans, we're trained in debate. Check that. I was trained to debate in high school. If you watch politics, it's about debate. If you watch Law and Order, it's about debate. Our court system's about debate. That's what we swim in. And so we think that the only way to talk about politics is to debate. And debate is a game about winning and scoring points, right? And ultimately walking away the winner. That's what debate is, And dialogue is the opposite. Dialogue is a process of discovery, of learning, of listening, of hearing the other's story. And the truth is, if you're really in dialogue and it's really not challenging and interrogating one another, but sharing your stories, not only do you learn about them and about the issues that you're trying to understand, but you often learn things about yourself that you weren't aware of. You start to say, it's interesting that I think one of the reasons I get triggered by this issue is my brother. My brother, this was very important to him, and he was an addict, or he was this, and so allowing yourself to discover doesn't happen in debate. In debate, you're listening very carefully because you want to hear flaws in their logic that you can weaponize and score more points, but you're not allowing yourself to discover. And so I think that becomes really important, is that these school boards allow for a space where they can really learn and allow these people to feel heard and respected. And maybe somehow, again, what it requires is more time, which, Americans don't like because we're busy. There's too much to do, right? But maybe there are chief listening officers that every school or school board has, which really, their role is to respectfully listen and collect information from people and then feed it back to the decision-making process. Maybe that's a whole component to these school board processes that is underappreciated.
I was thinking about, if you were on a debate team and you told your debate coach, this other person said something that really got me thinking that maybe what I was saying that wasn't true.
Yeah.
The debate coaches would say,
Shut
whatever you do, don't go there.
Yeah, I know. That's weakness.
Yeah,
You're
going to lose the debate if you do that. And
unless it's a tactic that you're using to flip, to spring something on them,
Yeah,
well, that's what I mean. They're competitive games. That's what debate is. But that's not, and even people that say, well, we need political dialogue, they really mean to political debate. That's really
right.
what they mean. Because we don't know about, where's dialogue in our society? It's in AA meetings, it's in Quaker meetings, it's in some friend groups when there's, we lose someone and people tell their stories about, it's not a pervasive thing in our society, and it's not something we consider in problem solving. We really move right to debate.
Yeah, and having been a teacher educator most of my career, it's this idea of we like to think that we promote critical thinking, and how do you make sense of ideas and arguments, and what's a valid argument, and where does evidence and logic come into it, and we want people to learn how to do that. But there's another aspect to it that I'm learning now that really wasn't part of my work, and I don't think many of my colleagues, which is, what does it really mean to engage in dialogue and to listen, to try to understand it's mostly about how can I convince other people that my argument is a good one. And that's very, very different. And then I think about, Peter, there's just when young people see adults and leaders doing that kind of thing, and they show up or hear about what's going on school board meetings, it's no wonder that students themselves would do it with each other and with their parents.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. There is a thing in psychology called integrative complexity. It's a kind of way of problem solving, and it suggests that some of the best decisions are made and problems are solved by a combination of two things. One is widening your understanding of a phenomenon, different ways to think about it and look at it, and then ultimately synthesizing it to make a decision, right? You need to be able to open up in order to close. And that, there's a book called Super Forecasters. It's written by Philip Tetlock, and this is a project he's done called the Good Judgment Project with the CIA to try to understand the best decision makers and forecasters in the world. And this is what they do. And this is what we're talking about, is that through dialogue, you open up and you listen and you discover about things about yourself and your own ambivalence and the issues and the other. And you take a lot of broader information in, and then from that, you can make better decisions. We don't have patience for that. We need to invest in that first.
You don't have patience for it unless you get to a point where you're just sick and tired and you're exhausted and you realize whatever I have been doing isn't working. Yeah. And then maybe you can open up to the possibility of doing something different. I've sort of come to that place myself after all these years and just getting beaten down with this polarization and feeling like this isn't working, not listening, not engaging. And so I've been doing more of it myself personally. And what I'm discovering is it's really gratifying. I'm learning about myself. I'm thinking about the problems differently. And I'm understanding that the people that I made assumptions about don't always think the way I thought they would think. It's easy to stereotype and to make assumptions about what I thought they believed. And for those reasons, I didn't want to talk to them. But now that I am, it's actually gratifying and I want to do more of it. So there is and I think in this political courage challenge you're talking about, the hope is that people will try these things, think about themselves a bit. And as they start engaging, will get more drawn into it because they'll discover some pleasant outcomes.
Yeah, there's value in it for you and your experience of the world. Absolutely.
Well, Peter, I want to thank you so much for being part of Courageous Conversations about our schools. I really appreciate you being part of this.
My pleasure. It was a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
I've learned more about conflict. I keep learning about conflict and my own assumptions about change, as you urge us to do, is we have to change our thinking about change. And I think I'm learning about what it might take to shift from the kind of unhealthy, toxic conflict we see in so many school systems, not to no conflict, but to the kind of healthy conflict that enables school systems, teachers, and school leaders to do better by the students and communities they serve. For those listening, you can find this and all of our episodes at schoolconversations.org and on most podcasting platforms, including Amazon Music, where they are featuring some of our recent episodes. I'm told that if you ask Alexa to play Courageous Conversations about our school's podcast, Alexa will play the most recent episode. Pretty amazing. Well, that's it for today. So long, everyone.